Thank you all so much for being here, and to the people who are joining us on Facebook Live, hello. Everybody is talking about AI. AI, everybody's talking about it, right? Well, I'm here today to challenge the idea that AI should stand for artificial intelligence. I do not believe that intelligence is artificial. And as entrepreneurs, you have so much to think about. Data, how to use data, machine learning, deep learning, and then AI becomes this catch basin for all these technologies that are artificial and intelligent. Instead, I'm here to challenge you to think about the idea that we should think about AI instead as applied imagination, okay? If we think about intelligence as artificial, it enables us to outsource our ethics to machines, which is very dangerous. It enables us to think of technology as something that is separate from us. And right now, to a large extent, it is. That phone that I carry in my pocket, that tether, old ball and chain, it's great, right? Connects me to the world, connects us to everybody who's watching right now, but it's also becoming an addiction in a sense. But it's still separate from us in many ways. I don't think we are as separate from technology as we like to think we are, though. I think that our brains are expanding because of it. And as a result, we are changing, obviously, right? Now, if we think about AI as artificial, the ethics of that become questionable. How can Mark Zuckerberg say he couldn't have possibly imagined the impact that Facebook would have on the election? The reason he's able to say that is because we know that as people, we're not great at thinking about extrinsic consequences of what we create. And for the most part throughout history, the effects of our technologies have been fairly local. We could argue back and forth about that. The world is only so big, wars have a lot of impact, but the results have been fairly local. We don't have that luxury anymore. We live on a tiny hunk of rock. So as entrepreneurs, anyone in business, technology used to be a differentiator. Of course, for many companies, it still is. Many companies still build their own technologies. But increasingly, you don't have to build your own technology. You can buy it. If you can buy it, then it's not much of a differentiator. Anyone can buy technology. So what is the differentiator? I would argue that it is really only imagination at this point. So what do I mean by imagination? I run a company in New York called Science House with James Jorash, who's an inventor. And as an inventor, his specialty is innovation. And as a futurist, my specialty is imagination. So we always say at Science House, innovation without imagination is directionless, and imagination without innovation is philosophy. So we are always struggling to find the pragmatic sweet spot between innovation and imagination. And I think that's what entrepreneurs need to do today. So how do we think about imagination? It sounds kind of whimsical and fancy, right? Imagination, something kids do. I would argue actually that what kids are doing is practicing to be adult problem solvers, and we systematically beat that out of them as they enter school and then enter the workforce, something else that we have to really think about changing. But there's a book called The Imagination Gap, and the author, Brian Reich, came to Science House to interview me about imagination. And I was on the tail end of the interview process, so he had already interviewed almost everybody else for the book at that point. And he said that my interpretation of imagination was different than anyone else's. And so that's what I want to share with you here. What is it that makes my definition different? So everyone else for the book more or less said, imagination is, it's indefinable, it's nebulous, it's something creative people do. Well, everyone's creative. Creativity is everywhere. The only difference is how you tap into it and how you access it, right? So I like to think of imagination this way. On one side of the spectrum, you have what I call fantasizers, okay? People who can conjure any image in their heads. When you hear someone say, like, I'm the idea person, they don't think about execution, That's a fantasizer, okay? They don't worry about the feasibility of it. They just, like, they can picture it so it can happen. That's a beautiful thing. I'm not knocking it, but it's on the outer side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, we have followers, people who want a path cut for them. They don't want to have to think about it. They want you to tell them exactly how it's done. So on this continuum, roughly midway across, we have the concept of applied imagination that I'm here to discuss with you, okay? It's very pragmatic. It's how you get from A to B. So the ideas you come up with should be in relation to a specific problem that you're trying to solve. So I have a way of framing it in my mind that I'd like to share with you that I think is helpful and useful. You always have a path you want to go from A to B. As an entrepreneur, that path might be from mind to market, but it's anywhere you are and anywhere you want to go. Now, B, the location you're going to, may change, so the path may change along the way. But for the sake of this conversation, let's just picture A to B, okay? On that path, you're going to have tangible elements and you're going to have nebulous elements. Your brain is always going to gravitate toward the familiar, tangible things on that path, which can easily fool you into believing that those things are still important and relevant, when in many cases they may no longer be important or relevant, but we cling to them. Those are our habits that we have created over the years, okay? Also on that path, we have nebulous things, and it's very difficult for our brains to make sense of nebulous things. So we tend to deprioritize those things and focus on the things that feel familiar to us. Our brains are great at familiarity and visuals, okay? We have a civil war in our brains between stability and novelty, and it's different parts of the brain that crave those two things, right? So imagination, I came to this through the idea that all the clients that I work with have the same problem across industries. And the problem is they're steeped in industrial era thinking, and they're trying to leap straight out of that and land right in the intelligence era, okay? But let's think about, what does the industrial era look like? It's tangible, it's heavy. When you were at work, you punched in, you knew you were at work. When you were done for the day, you punched out. You did not have a phone following you around that your boss could connect with you, and frankly, you didn't have a conveyor belt or a factory at home, so you couldn't just get those extra couple hours in at night or on the weekend, right? And I'm not glamorizing the life that people led as factory workers, but what I'm saying is at least you knew you were at work, and when you left, you were no longer at work. We still run our workplaces with the industrial era mindset that faster and faster and faster is better. We have to work smarter, not faster. But you can see how in the industrial era those things were tangible and heavy and familiar, and if an engine didn't work, it didn't work, you fixed it. It was very binary. Here we are in the intelligence era, heading into it. We're not fully in, but we're heading there. How are we supposed to make sense of insights from data, algorithms that decide on their own what they're going to be pushing to the top of your news feed or making decisions for society? And it's a black box, and I don't know how they make decisions, right? These are ethical considerations that are extremely complicated and hard for our brains to make sense of. And so we are unprepared to leap straight from this measured industrial reality into this nebulous, complex, math and physics-driven, software-infused new reality. So I would argue what we need in between is more imagination, okay? So I call it the imagination age. Let's look at a couple of just examples of things that are happening that really put a fine point on how strange things are. How many of you have seen Sophia, the robot who was the first citizen granted citizenship in Saudi Arabia recently? Anyway, Sophia, okay, same robot that if you Google her, there's a video, hot robot at South by Southwest says she wants to destroy humans. Same Sophia, okay? Aaron Sorkin interviewed her when she became a citizen in Saudi Arabia, and she's been interviewed a bunch of times. And someone asks her, Sophia, why are you a woman? She's not a woman. She appears to be a woman. Why? Why is Amazon Alexa a woman? Why do I hear a woman's voice and there's a woman's name? These are not women. This is software. We are completely unequipped to think about this. Sophia just looks puzzled when people say puzzling things and smiles when people say funny things, basically flatters people's egos and responds. So as humans, are we that easy to fool? You throw a bunch of hardware together, you call it Sophia, and we're like, it's a citizen, right? We are not equipped to deal with this mentally, okay? Another example, how many of you have heard of the Family Romance Corporation? Family Romance Corporation. It's a Japanese company where people can rent people to pretend to be a date or, in some cases, a parent. So the founder of Family Romance Corporation has been pretending to be the father of an 8-year-old girl basically for her entire life, and she thinks he's his that he is her father. Again, we are becoming isolated, socially separate from each other, to the point where we need to pay other people to pretend to be family members of ours. Now, I'm not here to judge that, but I am here to say it says something about modern society. And my favorite example, and the thing I've been completely obsessed with now since it started, is a company called DeepMind that was acquired by Google. And DeepMind created AlphaGo. AlphaGo is a program that has now beat many human Go champions, but at the time, it was Lee Sedol, a Korean Go champion. And in Korea, Go is a way of life, okay? So millions of people were watching these matches to see who would win these Go games. And they were convinced that who would win? Human or machine? Human, of course. I mean, this guy's dedicated his entire life to Go, right? Who won? Machine. By a little or by a lot? By a lot. By a lot. Crushed him. But the interesting thing about these games is what Lee Sedol said, which is he learned from AlphaGo the art of the possible in Go. He has dedicated his life to Go and never really understood it until he saw a machine play, because the machine plays so unlike a human. So are we going to learn what it means to be human from the technology that we create, right? We're arguing about whether can we ever create a general purpose AI that can think for itself. Well, I would argue back to the human saying it. Do you think for yourself? Do we think for ourselves? We are so much more predictable than we think we are, okay? But we find ourselves right now, regardless. Oh, by the way, DeepMind has moved on to other things now. What they have moved on to is creating imagination-augmented machines. What these machines can do is look for all the information in their environment to make better decisions. Now, you could look at that and say, well, that's depressing. As humans, we can't possibly do that. If I asked you all to close your eyes right now and I quizzed you about this room, you'd get most of the questions wrong, right? Do you even know how many other people are in this room with you right now? Could you name one of them, right? It's very hard for us to look at our environments and cull the right information to make decisions. But we don't have to do it by ourselves. We are creating two things. One is technology that can help us instead of us serving it, okay? And two is an obvious awareness that we are not maximizing our potential as human beings, okay? Now, some people have a vision of the future that is completely apocalyptic. Robots are going to steal our jobs. We're living in this horrible reality. Other people have a utopian vision that we're creating technologies that will serve us and finally give us the leisure time we so richly deserve. But are we even equipped to come up with a sense of purpose, to keep ourselves occupied if we had everything being done for us? Even in that utopian vision, we're still having shortcomings as human beings. But I think we can fix that. Either way, whatever happens in the future, we have a golden period of humanity right now upon us. As entrepreneurs, we face the need to put our imaginations first and ask ourselves, what kind of companies can we create that serve humanity and help to connect humanity. And I don't just mean to serve better ads. I mean to really connect people on a deeper level. What is that deeper level? What defines us as human beings? And I will leave you with one thought before I take some questions, which is other people are thinking about this. I'm not the only one, right? Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and a bunch of other people, very smart people, realized we need to start taking control of the ethics of this situation. And they created what I would call a helpful and painfully idealistic set of principles. Some of them are great, but the Asilomar principles it's called. 2 of them concern me deeply, number 10 and number 11. Number 10, that we have to align these autonomous systems to create value for people. And number 11, which I will read to you so that I don't get it wrong, is really about human values, okay? So number 11, AI systems should be designed and operated so as to be compatible with ideals of human dignity, rights, freedoms, and cultural diversity. To which I say, amen, but are those our human ideals? Really? Look at the world we're living in. So are we projecting a sense of who we hope we are onto these machines and just crossing our fingers that they'll miraculously cherish us as much as the illusion of how much we cherish ourselves? Or are we going to do something about it? And the people who are best equipped to do something about it are entrepreneurs who use their imaginations first to imagine the future that they want us to live in, and then do what we call at Science House, the tedium of creativity. These ideas do not create themselves, right? We have to struggle in the direction of feasibility, even as we keep the art of the possible in mind, and continuously try to find ways to execute. That is going to require us to collaborate with each other in unprecedented ways, to really understand, maybe for the first time, what it is that makes us human, and to be mindful of that when we then think about technology. But the obsession with technology first is not serving us. So I will pause there and see if any of you have questions or comments before I continue. Yes.
How do you think life's purpose fits into the artificial intelligence landscape?
So how do I think life's purpose fits into the artificial intelligence landscape? I don't believe it's artificial. I believe intelligence, it's a great question though. It is the trillion-dollar question, right? I don't believe it's artificial, and I think we're conditioning ourselves to believe that it's artificial. And so it's separate from us, and we're human, right? Purpose is going to be the number one question that, well, we're looking at a huge skills gap right now, for example, right? So we keep saying to ourselves, oh, in the future, either robots are going to steal jobs or they're going to create new jobs. We have millions of unfilled jobs right now in the United States that we don't have the skills to fill. That requires imagination, right? Because we have to think ahead about what those are. Life's purpose, let's just imagine for a second a reality where everything's taken care of for us. Amazon delivers our meals every day, and we've got things done for us, and robots in our bloodstream that monitor our health, and perfect utopia. What are we going to do with ourselves all day long? Because right now there's a huge epidemic of people living in their parents' basements playing video games all day, right? Now, knock yourself out. Again, not here to judge, but I'm just here to say, is that a life? Are we living in the Matrix? And if we don't do something about it, or come to terms with the fact that that's just an inevitability of the reality we're living in, and take a pragmatic approach to reorganizing and redesigning our society. But purpose is at the heart of that. Companies need to deal with that, individuals need to deal with that, and society needs to deal with that. And what is it that makes life purposeful? Is that something I decide for myself? Is that something society decides for us? We really need to get serious about that question. I think imagination will help, though.
Can I ask one more follow-up question? What is the purpose of, is there a purpose of the imagination age?
That's a great question. Is there a purpose of the imagination age? And there is. The purpose of the imagination age is to help us take a breath, right, and understand that we are in transition from the industrial era into the intelligence era. and that the chaos and fear that that transition is causing in people can be mitigated through focus, curiosity, using our imaginations to picture the future that we want to inhabit, and then working tirelessly toward that future instead of just letting the future happen to us. It is hard work. Imagination sounds like it's so much fun, like you're in a hammock daydreaming, but that's a fantasizer, right? Applied imagination is a combination of ideas and extremely hard focused execution, right, in this context. All right, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I kind of love your Go example because I've also been a little bit of a amateur Go player, but I'm pretty terrible at it. But I think the Korean player who saw the moves and he saw a computer imagine new moves that he could not even dream of. So is it up to us to use AI to bring imagination and to bring new moves to what we do as business?
I love that question, Devin. So is it up to us, much like Isidal saw moves he couldn't dream of, right, that the AlphaGo made? Yes, I believe it is up to us to, as entrepreneurs, to do that. Do you want to say something?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is up to us because we are learning what's possible. We only have limited bandwidth. As smart as we are, our brains have limited storage space. We cannot process every pixel. It's too much, right? We finally have an opportunity to have our imaginations augmented by brute computational power, as well as, you know, the AI, you know, the applied imagination, for example, that DeepMind is coming up with now, it goes so far beyond brute force. It's just almost an unimaginable capacity for processing data. You need imagination to figure out what you're going to do with that data, though. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi, Rita. Thanks
Hi,
for
Annalie.
an inspiring talk
Thanks for being
and
here.
inspiring ideas. If you were to have a magic wand and change the course of the education strategy for the future in this country and others, what would you be advising in terms of the things that we need to bring into the learning process for the imagination age, where we need to learn from machines and work with them to take us to another level?
I love that question, and it's a question that's dear to my heart, right? So if I had a magic wand, what would I change about the education system for the imagination age? We are really, in the United States and the world, right? So there's a lot of different variability in how kids are educated around the world, some under horrible circumstances, some not at all, and some being forced into an extremely dull industrial era education that is really not serving them or serving society. This is an area where we have not applied imagination to think about how we're going to transform education. So about 10 years ago, I got really interested in virtual reality for education. So IBM was doing a project that I was looking into that they did protein folding in a virtual world. And you can see it happen right in front of you, right? Or you could be really tiny and go into a giant heart and go through the chambers of the heart and see it from a totally different perspective. Like a magic school bus, exactly. So while we perceive there's so many different camps, right? Some people perceive technology as dehumanizing and we shouldn't bring it into the classroom. Other people feel like we need to, tech up education. I think it's a combination of a few skills, and I think these kind of immersive experiences can help. Entrepreneurship, number one. If you can't think like an entrepreneur, even if you don't become an entrepreneur, entrepreneurial thinking can help everyone, right? Improvisation, right? Right now, we're training kids to just sit all day, bell rings, go to the I love to learn, and school drove me crazy. It was like prison. Counting down the days, like running my tin cup along the bars of the school because I couldn't wait to get out. Less structure. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, but the things that we need are less structure, more curiosity, the ability for children to experience different things. Every scientist I've ever met had a moment in childhood where someone told them something that opened up their mind to the possibility of the natural world and the exploration. If you don't have those encounters, you don't know what you might end up being into. And this goes back to your question about purpose. One of the things we need to educate kids for is how to find a niche for themselves in the world and to get into a flow state, okay? And the reason I'm not knocking video games is because I think that might be it for some people, and it's not up to me to judge. But if we can get more people in a flow state, doing things that are productive for society, then it's a win for them and a win for society. So I think we need to educate kids. Big believer in STEM education, huge believer in the arts. I really think it comes down to a marriage between art and science, the ability to visualize complex concepts in an extremely simple way. Right? Because right now we have a huge divide too between the experts who have so much detailed information about math and science and software development and coding, and then other people who are consumers but don't understand how to create the same way. I want more creators.
And some ethics training in there as well.
Ethics training would be great, but ethics training is very complicated, right? And you need look no further than driverless cars for that. I mean, if you have two driverless cars and they both have software programmed by the same mothership, then they can act in concert. But what if one of them is programmed to protect that target at all costs and the other one's programmed you can see very quickly how it devolves. Ethics is a living, breathing expression of morality, and morality is not something humans have been good at authentically putting into practice consistently. So we need to come to terms with that. Does anyone else have a question? Or what about on the live stream?
Okay, so we have a few questions from social media. The first one is, as businesses are planning for the 2018 year and upcoming year, how can they approach that business planning with more imagination?
I love that question. So how to approach business planning with more imagination. Number one, question the assumptions that you make, right? Because so much of our planning is just based on outdated thinking. So get comfortable being uncomfortable, questioning whether the assumptions you make at the core of your planning process are reflective of the demands of reality. And for businesses, that starts with your customers, right? Very often, large companies particularly get very inward looking, and it becomes about planning for what works for us. Well, if you're a company, you have to start with what works for your customers. So make yourself uncomfortable. I would say go figure out what your customers want, and is what you're doing a match for that? And then how do you apply imagination? The trick isn't, if you're looking for, I would say customer intimacy almost, right? You want to give your customers what they want before they even know they want it. If they're already expressing to you what they want, you've already gone too far not giving it to them, right? So it requires imagination to really bond with customers and understand them on a deeper level, and it requires empathy.
And as a follow-on to that, how do you think that businesses can really foster more imagination on an ongoing basis with their employees?
How can businesses foster more imagination with their employees? So again, companies are of all sizes, right? So smaller companies are a little more chaotic. It's a good kind of chaos, right? You have a lot more flexibility to try things out and see what works. As a company scales, it becomes very difficult to manage all these people. So what ends up happening? You get processes in place, you get systems in place, and sometimes those systems become like a clutter that you can't even parse apart anymore. So to put more imagination into place, again, I would say, do you have any rules in place that nobody even knows why they're there anymore, that are so cumbersome that they're slowing you down to the point where you really can't serve your customers in a way that they need to be served? Apply imagination to that. Allow yourself, we think of children, again, imagination is a childhood thing. Children are solving problems. We were all children once. Every person who is an adult today was once a little child. When you were a child, think about the time that you just wanted to be left alone so you could pretend that a box was a spaceship, or your equivalent of that, okay? You just want to be alone so you or with your friends, not doing homework, not going to somebody's house because you had to, just playing, okay? We think of play as a frivolous activity, but play is how we solve problems. And there are ways that companies can bring in more of a spirit of play without being childish, but you can be childlike. So you can be mature and childlike. You can also be an adult and be childish, which is a very bad combination. Anyone else? Questions? You can ask me anything. It doesn't have to be about imagination. Yes.
I remember my first question about the imagination age and the purpose. One of the purposes it sounded like was taking a step back and like relieving the pressure. And I think what you just mentioned with the childlike, the reason why they're able to play is because there is no feeling of pressure that a lot of adults feel constantly. Like, trying to get to the question, but the question is, how do we relieve some of the pressure that all of us feel all the time?
That is an excellent question. So what is the source of the pressure that we feel, right? Sometimes it's that we're not doing enough. Sometimes it's that we're gonna fail. Whatever those sources of pressure are, I think a lot of them are illusions. And there's an excellent book called Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse. And finite games are games like Go. They have a winner and a loser. They have rules. They take place at a specific time and place. When they're over, right? Infinite games are games that are played just for the sake of getting more people into the game, okay? So personally, I'm an infinite game player. Pace wins the race. You don't have to do everything in one day. You have a lifespan. And I would argue, this may be a little more philosophical than we're looking for here today, but I'm just gonna say it. We're always going through life. It's like we're holding a basketball underwater because we all are aware of mortality. It's part of the human condition, and we're avoiding it, and we look for like that nail to hang our anxieties on. So everything becomes a big deal, and everything becomes crushing pressure and to us. It's okay to relax and give ourselves some breathing room and be a little bit easier on other people too. Give people the space to take a little bit more risk, right? Companies keep talking about we want to be less risk averse, we want to take more risks, but then when people fail, we overreact like they've done the most horrible thing in the world, One of the reasons Amazon is so successful is because Jeff Bezos doesn't mind letting people fail. Things fail at Amazon. You've got a million other things going on that are gonna win, right? So give ourselves the same space to realize that do the best you can with the lifespan that you have, be good to other people, create things that help, and go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning feeling like I'm healthy, I've got another day of effort. That's kind of how I look at it. If you're healthy, you have everything, in many ways. And we forget to take the things we have and really appreciate them, I think.
Thank you.
When you were talking about how we always can bring our work home to us now, and we're always connected, and kind of the drawbacks, but also the benefits of that, I'm wondering if you have found, or you think that if we try to stay less connected, either by not checking our email when we get home, if you found that that leads to more imagination or more creativity.
I love that question. I think at the heart of it is multitasking. So we can bring work home. We also can bring friends and family and everything else to work with us. So how many times are you at a meeting and someone's sitting on their phone and scrolling through? And so we're not great multitaskers at all. And we kind of got this idea somewhere along the line that because we could multitask, it was great. Suddenly we can get all these things done. So I think focus is really the answer to that. And because we're all connected all the time, there's always going to be this feeling, you know, this fear of missing out. Like if I don't check my phone for an hour, anything could happen. That's the reality. But that was true before we had phones, right? I mean, there were plenty of times as a teenager, it would have been awesome to call my parents because I was stuck in a bad situation, but I didn't have a phone, right? So now the connectivity has created a sense of urgency that we have to be connected all the time, or we start to get this weird feeling like we're disconnected. I think we need to get comfortable with the feeling of being disconnected, and do it in ways that are comfortable for us. So for example, like if people really just feel terrible being disconnected, let people know, hey, I'm offline for a while, or you know, take a break though, because we experience time differently when we focus. And I really increasingly feel when we're doing whatever it is we're doing, we should be just absolutely present for that activity. Or don't do it. If it's not worth your time, don't do it to begin with. And if it is worth your time, like focus and allow yourself to really be present. So I think disconnect if you can, with the understanding that we're always going to be toggling back and forth between these two realms. We live in a hybrid reality now. That's a great question.
Hi.
Hi.
I really liked the speech. So I've worked with small companies and I've worked for very corporate firms, and I think my question is, with entrepreneurs and startups, they have a lot of freedom to play and experiment and invest time in R&D. With corporate firms, we don't have a lot of leeway for that, and also we don't have funding for that because we're binded by like client expectations. You know, funding goes into project-specific resources. And how would you encourage large businesses and corporations to invest in R&D, to give time to play? Because in essence, large corporations have more resources, more funding, and they can allocate that and kind of bring into fruition that imagination.
Yeah.
And so what would your advice be for corporations?
So that's an excellent question, and I also have experience, you know, co-directing Science House, but I had my own small company before Science House, and we have a portfolio of startups at Science House, so we have that whole startup mentality, and small company, mid-sized company. Huge companies are our main clients at Science House, and that's what they come to Science House for. So that question is a fascinating one, though, because many small companies also have limited funding. You have limited runway, right? So in a sense, funding is always the great limitation on imagination. I would argue at any size company. I mean, at Science House, we're free to come up with anything we want, but we also need to, you know, bring in revenue just like any company would. So at a certain point, you still have to choose from among your ideas and invest. I think where large companies sell themselves short is in the ideation process. So they often don't come up with a lot of possibilities to choose from. They often just kind of go into the next thing that feels like the thing they should do. And part of that is risk aversion, but risk is very poorly understood. So a lot of large companies don't want to see people fail because they feel like they're wasting money because they have to think about their shareholders, for example. Understood. You know, not to pound the Amazon drum, but one of the reasons I do respect Jeff Bezos is in this specific regard, because he sends out his first shareholder letter with every shareholder letter he sends out. And in that letter, he made it clear they have a long road view, that Amazon is not going to be beholden to the next quarter. And of course, they were hugely criticized for that for a long time, which also is what threw their competition off kilter, because they were like, Amazon, you know, they're hemorrhaging money. So the reality is, it's a mindset that you have to be willing, and you can do it in any circumstances with any level of funding, as long as you have a roof over your head. It's like Maslow's hierarchy. If you have a roof over your head and you wake up healthy and you can think, then that day you can come up with ideas. And so I would argue that large companies need to give people space to breathe. And one of the ways we do this at Science House is we help them with their meetings. Because meetings, every day, meeting. You go from one meeting to the next, and what gets sacrificed? Thinking time. So when you sacrifice thinking time, you're never going to come up with the best ideas you could have come up with. You're only going to start inadvertently going down the road of whatever it is you're doing. So I think thinking time is underrated. It goes back to imagination. What is it that makes us human? Is the ability to stop and think and be aware and change course, right? If we don't want to outsource that to machines, we need to really think long and hard about thinking.
This is somewhat related to what Gary's talking about. I think it was Google who started the 20% time. Do you think that's an effective way of getting employees to get off of their daily routines and do other things that are outside?
That's a great question. My understanding is Google only really does that in small pockets now, but they used to, when they were a smaller company, like many companies, we think of them still as a small company, but they've grown significantly since then, right? They have so many smart people working for them that, in my opinion, I would think that would definitely help because they're going to generate ideas and take a breather that's going to contribute. To me, it's less about the percentage of time and more about enculturating the notion that it's okay to take time to think, because in the modern world, we're so ever present. If you don't see my face and I'm not busy all the time, you start to question what kind of value I'm really adding to the organization. If you see me at my desk, like, well, I'm just thinking right now, you know, what do you mean you're just thinking right now? Like, I'm rushing around all day going from meeting to meeting and you're sitting back doing nothing. We think of thinking as doing nothing. That is a big problem. And if that's going to be the way we think about humans, then we welcome our robot overlords because we need somebody to do the thinking for us, right?
Rita, I have another question. I'm really intrigued by the concept of artificial intelligence versus applied imagination and what that inflection creates. And so it kind of brings me to thinking about whether the whole notion of universal basic income is really a failure of imagination, particularly by the super rich elite. You know, I was very struck by the fact that last year at the World Economic Forum, the gap between the wealthiest 63 people in the world was the same as, you know, the rest of the world's wealth. This year, it was 8 people who held the same wealth as the rest of the world. So my question is really around this notion of universal basic income and purpose and sort of anarchy.
I like that you threw anarchy in there at the end. It's a very complicated question, and it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about at Science House. So universal basic income is one of these ideas that on the surface sounds fantastic, right? Why shouldn't every human being be having the basic necessities covered? From an idealistic perspective, I want to love that idea. This is one of those ideas that I want to say, of course, why would we not do that? But the reality, the math of this idea starts to set in. The whole way we think about resources starts to set in. The cost of living is going to decrease as things get cheaper. Well, hopefully, that's the notion behind it. But the reality is billions of people on a planet, less need for people to, skills gap growing, you know, automation coming, it's going to hit us like a wave. So what do we do? Now, let's pretend, for the sake of the argument, that we now live in a reality where we have universal basic income. Every single one of you in this room has a universal basic income. You don't have to worry. Then what do you do with yourself? If we study history, and part of being a futurist is studying history, to see the patterns that humans have experienced before. This is not the first time where we've had growing inequality between the wealthiest. It may be more pronounced than ever before, but I've been studying the Renaissance and the Reformation in Europe, and being a peasant in Europe during that time was to be a victim of wealthy elites coming through with armies, you know, populations of your town starving to death, dying from the plague, you know, having soldiers come through and take your food. So we've had this problem in humanity for a very long time, and it has never ended well for us. Almost every crumbled empire crumbles because you cannot sustain an environment. unless wealthy elites are going to build their own cities and never leave them, which those cities will become prisons to them, imagine having all the money in the world and never being able to leave your little prison that you built for yourself. You might have great amenities in that prison, but at that point, it's equally dehumanizing, okay? So I think that the wealth inequalities also contribute to the kind of corruption that makes it impossible for people to feel like they can contribute. So other than the resource issue, it's also a purpose issue. Because if I can't contribute meaningfully and generate revenue because of corruption, right, increased corruption, what am I going to do with my life? What kind of business am I going to start? And I'm not talking about 2017. I'm talking about a future state where it's grown to its peak. So these are issues we have to think about now. And I don't know where the money for universal basic income is going to come from. That's the problem, right? It's an idealistic scenario that hasn't been as well thought out as the desire to want to like it. And the desire to want to like things gets us into a lot of trouble as human beings.
All right, if we don't have any more in person, we have 2 more from social media.
Okay.
So we have a question from social media. What is your biggest influence or influencers?
That's a great question. I am deeply influenced by spontaneity and serendipity, constantly meeting people and exchanging ideas with them and having unexpected things happen as a result of that. I'm constantly surprised by people, and I find it very influential to my imagination to study history and look for patterns, and then look for people out in the world who are doing the kind of things that are the right thing to do at this cycle in the pattern, if that makes sense. So everything is cyclical, and there are always people building the next thing. There are always people who are on to the next thing. I'm very interested in people who are on to the next thing and who are really committed to doing it in as ethical a way as humanly possible. And the world is really filled with people like that. It's just that their voice isn't as loud. And I feel really committed to helping to broadcast those people's voices. And I also feel like I'm in the service of those people. So I spend a huge amount of my time every day really trying to help people bring their own imaginations out. So it's less about what do I think and more about what's in you and how can we focus and help you get that out into the world. So there's no specific one person or thing. It's more that, to me, it's like, it's the interplay between art and science and creativity and all these people who are creating things that surprise me every single day.
So we have another question from social media. How are millennials pushing businesses to be more imaginative, or do you believe that they are?
The millennials question is a very interesting question, right? Because there's a lot of obsession in, a lot of our big client companies about millennials. And it's kind of funny, I've been doing work around millennials for probably 10 years now, which means like some of the millennials that were millennials back then they're not so young anymore. Let's just put it that way. So how are millennials influencing? When I hear more experienced people talk about millennials, it kind of makes me laugh because I think, like, don't you remember what it was like to not have a mortgage or a family? Like, everyone was young once, and so you're different when you're young. It's just life. What makes millennials really different, though, is that an extremely talented millennial with digital native tech skills has the power that 10,000 people used to have. So it's not, to me, so interesting that all millennials are different. Like, oh, they want to go to the beach on Friday afternoon. Yeah, who doesn't? Like, does anybody in the workplace not want to go with them to the beach on Friday? Those kind of things are less interesting to me. What's really interesting is that the tech-savvy millennial, and I don't think workplaces really understand that, they're trying to cater to all millennials. Like, we're going to have, the office is going to be more whimsical because that's what millennials like. It doesn't matter what, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It matters, but what really matters is making sure that you get talented people who understand what they can create. And those people are in demand, and they're not easy to get. They are not easy to get. And most big companies don't really understand the value of those employees, and they're missing a huge opportunity there, I think. Are we, time for, okay.
Just wanted to make a quick comment on
Go
that.
ahead.
A lot of the millennials that I speak to work and family related. They talk about working for a company that has a purpose and a mission,
Yes.
which I think is newer because when we came out of college, we went to get a job or a career, but we didn't really look at the purpose of the organization or to see what the meaning of the organization is, where a lot of the kids now that I talk to are quitting jobs after less than a year saying, I have no purpose here. I come in, I punch my clock, I'm expected
I think
to do
that's
this and leave.
huge. And that to me is very hopeful. And I agree with you that I have seen that as well. And I feel like that's very hopeful because purpose is going to be such a huge issue that I love knowing that people are actually thinking about it and actively fighting against the lack of purpose, because it is going to take courage to walk away from a paycheck if it doesn't come accompanied with a sense of purpose. But as humans, I believe we need to resist situations that lack purpose at this point, because we're protecting the future of humanity by doing that, in my opinion. I mean, it sounds extreme, but I really believe that. So I love that millennials are focused on purpose, and I think that has to continue and grow. I support that. Anyone else? Questions, comments, grievances? Anything? All right.
I'll give you a quick question.
Yeah.
Earlier, when you mentioned that, when you mentioned that Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to
That's
the-
okay, I'll
the-
repeat.
Yeah, the appliance. 10, 15, 20 years from now, I mean, what do you think the benefits of doing that would for society?
I think that's a great question. So when Saudi Arabia granted citizenship to Sophia, what are the benefits of that 10, 15 years down the road for society, right? I think the implications, I mean, you know, there are issues already with real human women and their citizenship rights in Saudi Arabia, right? So a lot of people, the irony of Saudi Arabia being the first country to grant citizenship to a robot, I think is not lost on some people, right? So it's fascinating. And then in the future, what does that mean? I really don't believe right now that we are even mentally equipped. It would be like if I walked up to my dog and I started talking about, you know, quantum physics. She'd be like, I want a treat. Like, I don't even know what you're talking to me about right now, right? She doesn't know, she doesn't care, she doesn't even know I'm talking. I mean, she knows words are coming out. That's how I feel about our own ethics development. I feel like we think about ethics as this ivory tower thing, and we have faith in the law, that the law is going to, you know, be fair and just, but ethics requires that all of us really grapple with these ethical issues. If they were easy, we wouldn't need to even think about it. It would just unfold naturally. But ethics tells us who we are, and the decisions we make shape our society. So are we going to have, you know, robot citizens? The thing that people don't realize, I believe, that's kind of a smokescreen, because when we look at that robot, that looks like a person. Like, we have an uncanny valley. Do you know what uncanny valley is? When a robot looks too much like a person, we get creeped out. What's the uncanny valley for our brains? Where do we get creeped out like we don't understand? That concept is a little too human. Sophia is a bit of a smokescreen, in my opinion, because we made the hardware look like a person. So now we're like back on that, like robots are going to look like people, and there's going to be people walking around. I think software is more concerning because it's invisible. It's in a data center somewhere. It's off in the cloud, and it's making decisions that shape our society, but it doesn't have a human face. And as humans, we are exceptionally good at entrenched tribalism. We're like, you know, I look like this, and people who look like this, I'm comfortable, and people who don't, I'm not comfortable. Add robots to that. We've never mastered our own humanity when it comes to accepting human beings. So now you throw a robot in, and we're supposed to just be like, hey, Sophia, you know, she smiles when I talk, so I like her. Like, we're not mentally equipped to deal with this, but we're also not mentally equipped. Go back to what I said earlier about that path that has the tangible things and the nebulous things on it. Sophia is a tangible thing now. When we think Sophia, we think that robot that has that human face. We don't think about the invisible software that's governing the shape of our society because it's nebulous and we can't see it. But large companies especially need to start thinking about what they're doing with that data and how it impacts us. And we need to start thinking about how it impacts us as humans. Does that answer your question?
No.
So I don't know where it's going to head, but I think it's a smokescreen.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Anyone else? I've completely lost track of time, so I have no idea if we're over, under. Okay. Anybody else before we end? If you have a minute, if you want to ask another one. You're good? You guys have been amazing. Thank you. That was really fun. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Samsung, for having me.